Dawn breaks over the English Channel on June 6, 1944. Thousands of vessels churn through dark waters toward the coast of Normandy, France. Inside cramped steel boxes, young men grip their rifles and try not to vomit as waves slam against hulls. They're packed shoulder to shoulder, 36 soldiers per boat, heading straight into the teeth of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. These boats are called LCVPs. Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel. Most people will remember them by another name, Higgins boats. In the next few hours, more than 1,500 of these vessels will charge toward 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of French coastline. They'll carry the first waves of 156,000 Allied troops into what will become the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The boats hit the shallows. Ramps drop. Men pour out into chest-deep water, into machine gun fire, into chaos. Many will die before they reach the sand. But enough will survive. Enough will push forward. And by nightfall, the Allies will have their foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, will later say that without these boats, the invasion would have been impossible. He'll call their inventor Andrew Higgins the man who won the war for America. But here's the thing. These boats weren't designed for war. They weren't designed for the ocean. They weren't even designed for the military. They were designed for swamps. New Orleans, Louisiana, the 1930s. Andrew Jackson Higgins runs a small boat-building operation in a city famous for jazz, humidity, and corruption. He's in his 40s, built like a barrel, with a personality to match. Loud, stubborn, brilliant. The kind of man who makes enemies as easily as he makes boats. Higgins didn't start out building landing craft. He started out trying to make money in the Louisiana timber industry. The problem was geography. Southern Louisiana is a maze of swamps, bayous, marshes, and shallow rivers. The water's rarely more than a few feet deep, and it's choked with stumps, sandbars, and vegetation. Traditional boats with deep keels and exposed propellers get stuck or damaged constantly. So Higgins designed something different. Flat-bottomed boats that could float in just a few feet of water. The propeller sat in a semi-tunnel in the hull, protected from obstacles. The bow had a unique spoonbill shape that let the boat slide up onto muddy banks and then reverse back off without getting stuck. Simple, practical, perfect for the swamps. His customers were hunters going after ducks and alligators, fishermen working the bayous, oil prospectors exploring remote areas, and during Prohibition, bootleggers running illegal liquor through waterways where Coast Guard vessels couldn't follow. Higgins didn't ask questions. He built boats that worked, and people paid him for them. He called his design the Eureka boat. By the mid-1930s, Higgins Industries was producing them steadily. They were tough, reliable, and cheap to build. Mostly plywood and pine, assembled quickly. Nothing fancy, nothing military. But across the Pacific Ocean, military planners were watching something that would change everything. Japan invaded China in 1937. American military observers paid close attention to how Japanese forces conducted amphibious assaults. The Japanese had developed specialized landing craft that could deliver troops directly onto beaches without needing piers or ports. They were crude, but they worked. The United States Marine Corps realized they had a problem. America's potential enemies were on islands and across oceans. Japan in the Pacific, potentially Europe across the Atlantic. If war came, the Marines would need to conduct amphibious assaults, but they didn't have the equipment to do it. The Navy had some landing craft, but they were terrible, slow, awkward. They required docks or had to anchor offshore while troops climbed down cargo nets into smaller boats. The Marines needed something that could drive right up onto a beach, unload troops quickly, and get out. They needed it to be fast, maneuverable, and able to operate in shallow water under fire. They tested various designs through the late 1930s. Everything failed. Boats got stuck. Propellers broke. Hulls cracked. Troops couldn't get out fast enough. The Navy's Bureau of Ships kept proposing designs that looked good on paper but didn't work in practice. Then someone remembered the swamp boats from Louisiana. In 1938, the Marine Corps invited Andrew Higgins to demonstrate his Eureka boat at a testing facility in Norfolk, Virginia. Higgins showed up with his usual confidence and his unusual boat. The Marines set up obstacles: sandbars, shallow water, debris. They wanted to see if this civilian swamp boat could handle military conditions. Higgins' boat performed beautifully. It ran right up onto beaches. It backed off without turning around. It operated in water so shallow that Navy boats would have been stuck. The Marines were impressed. The Navy was not. The Navy's Bureau of Ships hated Andrew Higgins. Not personally at first, though that would come later. They hated that this loud civilian from Louisiana was trying to tell them how to build boats. They had their own designs, their own engineers, their own way of doing things. They didn't need some swamp boat builder interfering. The Bureau of Ships rejected Higgins' design. They said it wasn't suitable for military use. Too fragile, too simple, not enough armor. They had their own landing craft designs that were clearly superior, at least on paper. But the Marine Corps kept pushing. They'd seen Higgins' boat work. They'd seen Navy boats fail. They wanted the Eureka boat or something like it. The bureaucratic battle dragged on for months. Higgins grew increasingly frustrated. He'd shown them a solution and they were ignoring it because of pride and paperwork. Higgins had another problem. His boat could get troops to the beach. But then what? Soldiers had to climb over the sides while under fire. It was slow. It was dangerous. It was inefficient. The Marines wanted a better way to get troops out of the boat and onto the beach quickly. The answer came from an unexpected source: the enemy. In 1941, Marine Corps intelligence obtained photographs of Japanese landing craft. The Japanese had added a simple feature: a ramp at the bow that dropped down when the boat hit the beach. Troops could run straight out instead of climbing over the sides. It was obvious in hindsight, revolutionary in practice. The Marines showed Higgins the photos. They asked if he could add a bow ramp to his design. Higgins, never one to back down from a challenge, said yes. Within weeks, he'd redesigned the bow of his Eureka boat to include a drop-down ramp. The ramp was held up by cables and dropped when the coxswain pulled a lever. Simple, reliable, exactly what was needed. The new design could carry 36 fully equipped troops, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. It was 36 feet long, 10 feet wide, and drew only 3 feet of water at the bow, 2 feet at the stern. It could operate in water as shallow as 18 inches. Top speed was 12 knots. The hull was plywood over a wooden frame. The engine was a diesel gray marine, reliable and relatively quiet. This was the LCVP. Landing craft, vehicle, personnel, the Higgins boat. But it was still 1941. America wasn't at war yet. The Navy was still dragging its feet on orders. Higgins was still fighting bureaucracy. His company was surviving, but barely. He needed contracts. He needed the military to commit. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. Pearl Harbor burned. The Japanese attack killed over 2,000 Americans and destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet. The United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany declared war on the United States. America was now fighting a two-ocean war against enemies on opposite sides of the globe. Suddenly, amphibious assault capability wasn't a theoretical problem for peacetime planners. It was an immediate, desperate necessity. The Navy needed landing craft, thousands of them, and they needed them fast. Orders flooded into Higgins Industries. The company that had been building a few dozen swamp boats a year was now being asked to produce thousands of military landing craft. Higgins accepted the challenge with characteristic confidence. He promised the Navy he could deliver. He had to completely transform his operation. Higgins Industries expanded rapidly. He bought up warehouses and factories across New Orleans. He hired workers by the thousands. At peak production, Higgins Industries employed over 20,000 people. This was remarkable for several reasons. First, it was 1942 in New Orleans, Louisiana, the Deep South. Segregation was the law, but Higgins hired African Americans and paid them the same wages as white workers. He hired women for jobs traditionally reserved for men. He didn't do this out of pure altruism. He needed workers, and he didn't care about their race or gender as long as they could do the job. But in the context of 1940s Louisiana, it was radical. Second, he had to solve massive logistical problems. Plywood was in short supply. Engines were in short supply. Skilled workers were in short supply. Higgins developed assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. He broke down boat construction into simple, repetitive tasks that semi-skilled workers could learn quickly. He sourced materials from dozens of suppliers. He pushed his workers hard and paid them well. The boats started rolling out, LCVPs by the hundreds, then thousands. Higgins Industries also produced larger landing craft, the LCM, landing craft, mechanized, that could carry a tank and various other designs. But the LCVP was the workhorse, the boat that would carry the war to the enemy. By the end of the war, Higgins Industries would produce over 20,000 vessels of various types, 20,094 LCVPs alone. At peak production, the company was completing one boat every 2 hours. Each LCVP cost approximately $10,000. Simple, cheap, effective, but could they actually work in combat? That question would be answered in blood. Guadalcanal, August 7, 1942. The first major American amphibious offensive of World War II. Marines loaded into Higgins boats and headed for the beaches of a jungle island most Americans had never heard of. The boats performed as designed. They got troops ashore. But the Marines learned hard lessons about timing, approach angles, and vulnerability. A Higgins boat approaching a beach was essentially defenseless. The coxswain stood at the rear, steering. The troops were packed in the well of the boat, unable to see out, unable to return fire effectively. If the boat hit a sandbar or obstacle too far from shore, troops had to wade through deep water while under fire. If the ramp dropped too early, men drowned under the weight of their equipment. If it dropped too late, the boat could get stuck. Coxswains learned to read the water, to judge the approach, to time the ramp drop perfectly. It was as much art as science. Many coxswains were teenagers, 18 or 19 years old, responsible for delivering 36 men into combat, and then getting the boat back out for another run. The casualty rate among coxswains was horrific, but the boats kept coming. Guadalcanal, North Africa in November 1942, Sicily in July 1943, Italy at Salerno in September 1943. Each operation refined tactics. Each operation proved that Higgins' design worked. The boats could take punishment. They could operate in rough seas. They could deliver troops and vehicles directly onto hostile beaches. In the Pacific, the island-hopping campaign depended entirely on Higgins' boats. Tarawa in November 1943 was a bloodbath, partly because some boats got hung up on coral reefs. But the boats that made it through delivered Marines who eventually took the island. Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Every island assault used hundreds of Higgins boats. The boats weren't perfect. They offered no protection from enemy fire. The plywood hull could be penetrated by rifle rounds. A direct hit from artillery or a mortar would destroy one. Troops were vulnerable during the approach, and especially during the few seconds when the ramp dropped, and they had to run out into whatever was waiting on the beach. But they were fast. They were maneuverable. They could land anywhere, and there were thousands of them. The sheer numbers overwhelmed defenses. Even if the enemy destroyed some boats, dozens more would keep coming. By 1944, the Allies had conducted dozens of amphibious operations. They'd learned what worked and what didn't. They'd refined their tactics. They'd trained thousands of coxswains and crews, and they were planning the biggest amphibious assault in history, Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy, D-Day. Planning for the invasion of Normandy began in 1943. The challenge was staggering. The Allies needed to land over 150,000 troops on the first day, along with thousands of vehicles, tons of supplies, and establish a secure beachhead against German defenses. And they had to do it on open beaches, because the Germans controlled all the ports. The German Atlantic Wall stretched along the coast of France, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, mines, obstacles on the beaches designed to rip open landing craft, barbed wire. The Germans had years to prepare. They knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know where or when. General Eisenhower and his planners chose a 50-mile stretch of Normandy coastline. 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American forces would hit Utah and Omaha. British and Canadian forces would take Gold, Juno, and Sword. The invasion was scheduled for early June 1944, when tides and moon phases would be optimal. The logistics were nightmarish. Thousands of ships had to cross the English Channel in coordination. Paratroopers would drop inland to secure key positions. Naval bombardment would soften up defenses. Air support would strike German positions. And then the landing craft would go in. Higgins boats were the key to everything. Without them, the invasion couldn't happen. The Allies assembled over 1,500 LCVPs for the first waves, with thousands more in reserve. They were loaded onto larger transport ships that would carry them across the channel. At a designated point, the LCVPs would be lowered into the water, troops would climb down cargo nets to board them, and then they'd form up and head for the beaches. Eisenhower understood what was at stake. He'd seen Higgins boats in action in North Africa and Italy. He knew they worked, but he also knew that D-Day would be different. The Germans were expecting an invasion. The defenses were stronger. The stakes were higher. If the landing failed, the war could drag on for years. Tens of thousands of lives depended on those plywood boats getting troops from ship to shore. In England, troops trained for months. They practiced loading into Higgins boats. They practiced the approach. They practiced running off the ramp into water. Some training exercises went badly. In April 1944, during Exercise Tiger, German E-boats attacked a convoy of landing ships, killing over 700 American servicemen. It was a grim reminder of what could go wrong. But the training continued. The preparations continued. The boats were loaded. The troops were briefed. The weather was watched obsessively. Eisenhower needed a narrow window of acceptable conditions. Too much wind, and the boats couldn't operate. Too little moonlight, and the paratroopers couldn't find their targets. The tides had to be right. June 5th was the original date. The weather was terrible. Eisenhower postponed for 24 hours. June 6th looked marginally better. Not good, but acceptable. Eisenhower made the decision. The invasion was on. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, thousands of ships moved into position off the Normandy coast. Paratroopers were already on the ground inland, scattered and fighting in the darkness. Naval guns began pounding German positions. Bombers roared overhead, and in the gray dawn light, the Higgins boats began their run to the beaches. The coxswains gunned their engines. The boats formed lines, waves of them, heading toward the dark line of the French coast. Inside each boat, 36 men tried to keep their balance as waves crashed over the bow. Many were seasick. Most were terrified. They couldn't see where they were going. They could only hear the roar of engines, the crash of naval gunfire, and increasingly, the sound of German artillery and machine guns. Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing zone, went relatively well. The current pushed the first wave about a mile south of the intended landing point, but that turned out to be fortunate. The defenses there were lighter. Higgins boats delivered troops efficiently. Casualties were lighter than expected. By the end of the day, 23,000 troops would come ashore at Utah with fewer than 200 casualties. Omaha Beach was hell. The beach was a killing ground. Bluffs rose up from the sand, giving German defenders perfect fields of fire. The naval bombardment had largely missed the German positions. The bombers had dropped their payloads too far inland. The German 302nd Infantry Division was in position and ready. The first Higgins boats hit Omaha Beach around 6:30 in the morning. Ramps dropped. Men ran out into chest-deep water. German machine guns opened up. Men fell. Bodies floated in the surf. Some boats hit sandbars too far out. Troops had to wade 100 yards or more under fire. Many drowned, pulled under by the weight of their equipment. Some boats took direct hits from artillery. They exploded or capsized. Survivors struggled in the water. Other boats made it to the beach, dropped their ramps, and watched their entire load of troops get cut down in seconds. Coxswains backed off, went back for another load, and came in again. And again. The beach was chaos. Wounded men screamed. Dead men lay in the surf. Equipment burned. Tanks that were supposed to support the infantry had mostly sunk on the way in. The troops who made it to the beach were pinned down behind a low seawall or whatever cover they could find. For hours it looked like the landing might fail. But the Higgins boats kept coming. Wave after wave. More troops, more equipment, more supplies. The sheer volume of men and material eventually overwhelmed the German defenses. Small groups of soldiers found gaps in the defenses. They pushed up the bluffs. They flanked German positions. Slowly, painfully, the Americans gained ground. By the end of D-Day, approximately 2,000 American casualties had occurred at Omaha Beach. It was the bloodiest of the 5 landing zones, but the Allies had their beachhead. At Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces also used Higgins boats, along with other landing craft designs. The fighting was intense, but the landings succeeded. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, Over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy. The invasion had worked, and it had worked because of those plywood boats from Louisiana. Why did the Higgins boat succeed where other designs would have failed? The answer lies in understanding what the Germans expected and what the Allies delivered. The Atlantic Wall was designed to defend ports. The Germans knew the Allies would need ports to supply an invasion force, so they heavily fortified every port along the coast. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, massive concrete bunkers, heavy artillery, thousands of troops. The Germans believed that if they could hold the ports, they could stop any invasion. The Higgins boat made ports irrelevant. It could land troops and vehicles directly on open beaches. This meant the Allies could invade anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline. The Germans couldn't defend everywhere. They had to guess where the invasion would come. They guessed wrong, expecting Calais instead of Normandy. Even after the Allies landed at Normandy, the Germans still expected the real invasion at Calais. They held back reserves. By the time they realized Normandy was the main effort, it was too late. The Allies were ashore in force. The shallow draft of the Higgins boat was critical. It could operate in water too shallow for larger vessels. This allowed it to get troops very close to shore, minimizing the distance men had to wade under fire. At Omaha Beach, even a few extra yards of wading distance meant more casualties. The boats that got closest to shore gave their troops the best chance of survival. The bow ramp was essential. Troops could exit quickly, all at once. In earlier landing craft designs without ramps, troops had to climb over the sides one at a time. Slow, vulnerable. The ramp allowed a boat to disgorge 36 men in seconds. Speed saved lives. The boat's ability to reverse off the beach was crucial. It didn't have to turn around in shallow water, which would have made it an easy target. The coxswain could drop the ramp, let the troops out, raise the ramp, and back straight out into deeper water, then turn and head back for another load. Some boats made multiple trips on D-Day, delivering wave after wave of troops. The simplicity of the design meant it was reliable. There wasn't much to break. The engine was straightforward. The controls were simple. A teenager with a few weeks of training could operate one. This was important because the Allies needed thousands of coxswains. They couldn't all be experienced sailors. The low cost meant the Allies could build them in huge numbers. $10,000 per boat. Compare that to a tank which cost $50,000 or more. The Allies could afford to lose boats and still have plenty more. And they did lose boats. Hundreds were damaged or destroyed during the war. But there were always more. Germany's nightmare wasn't a superweapon. It wasn't a secret technology. It was a simple, cheap, mass-produced plywood boat that allowed the Allies to land armies anywhere they wanted. The Atlantic Wall became irrelevant. Fortress Europe was breached. And once the Allies were ashore in force, Germany's defeat was inevitable. After the war, General Eisenhower reflected on the factors that led to Allied victory. He mentioned air superiority, industrial production, the bravery of soldiers, and the skill of commanders. But he also singled out one man, Andrew Higgins. Eisenhower said, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." It's a remarkable statement. The supreme commander of Allied forces, the man who planned D-Day, crediting a civilian boat builder from Louisiana with winning the war. But Eisenhower understood something that many people missed. Wars are won by logistics as much as by courage. The Allies had brave soldiers. So did the Germans. The difference was that the Allies could put their soldiers where they needed them, when they needed them there. The Higgins boat made that possible. Without the LCVP, the Allies would have been forced to capture ports before they could land large forces. This would have meant smaller, more vulnerable landings. It would have given the Germans time to reinforce and counterattack. It would have made every amphibious operation far more difficult and costly. D-Day might have been impossible. The war in Europe could have dragged on for years longer. In the Pacific, the island-hopping campaign would have been impossible without Higgins boats. The Japanese held thousands of islands. The Allies couldn't capture them all, so they bypassed most and took only the strategic ones. But even those required amphibious assaults. Without the LCVP, the Pacific War would have been a very different conflict. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, also praised Higgins. He said that Higgins Industries had contributed more to the war effort than any other private company. This from a man who had initially opposed Higgins' designs and fought against giving him contracts. Even the Navy brass eventually had to admit that the swamp boat builder had been right. But for Andrew Higgins himself, victory was bittersweet. When the war ended in 1945, Higgins Industries employed over 20,000 workers and was producing boats at an incredible rate. Then, almost overnight, the contracts stopped. The military didn't need any more landing craft. They had thousands sitting in storage. Orders were canceled. Production lines shut down. Higgins tried to convert his factories to peacetime production. He built pleasure boats, commercial vessels, even experimented with prefabricated houses. Nothing worked. The company that had been so successful during the war couldn't find its footing in peace. Higgins Industries went bankrupt in the late 1940s. Andrew Higgins died in 1952, at the age of 65. He died relatively poor and largely forgotten by the public. The man who Eisenhower said won the war was not a household name. There were no parades for him, no monuments. He'd made and lost fortunes. He'd employed thousands. He'd built the boats that carried America to victory. And then he faded into obscurity. The boats themselves met similar fates. After the war, the military had over 20,000 LCVPs, and no use for them. Some were kept in storage for a while. Most were sold as surplus for pennies on the dollar. Civilians bought them and converted them for commercial use. Fishing boats, work boats, ferries. Some were just scrapped for materials. For decades, Higgins boats were a common sight in harbors and waterways around the world, repurposed and often unrecognized for what they'd been. The boats that had stormed Normandy were hauling cargo or tourists. The boats that had taken Iwo Jima were rusting in boatyards. Very few original Higgins boats survive today. Museums have a handful. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Higgins's hometown, has several on display. A few private collectors have restored examples, but out of over 20,000 built, only a few dozen are known to still exist. It's a strange fate for a weapon that changed history, but perhaps it's fitting. The Higgins boat was never meant to be glamorous. It was meant to be practical, simple, effective. It did its job and then it was discarded. No ceremony, no sentiment. Just like the young men who rode them into battle, it served when needed and was forgotten when the need passed. But the legacy of the Higgins boat lives on in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Every modern amphibious assault craft owes a debt to Andrew Higgins's design. The basic principles he established are still in use today. Bow ramps are universal on landing craft. The idea seems obvious now, but it wasn't until Higgins implemented it. Modern landing craft, from small assault boats to massive LCACs, landing craft air cushion, all use bow ramps to deliver troops and vehicles. Shallow draft for beach landing remains essential. Modern amphibious vessels are designed to operate in shallow water and deliver their cargo directly onto beaches. The principle Higgins developed for Louisiana swamps is now standard military doctrine worldwide. The concept of mass-produced, relatively inexpensive landing craft that can be deployed in large numbers comes directly from the Higgins model. Modern militaries understand that amphibious capability requires quantity as well as quality. You need enough boats to deliver an entire force in a short time window. The Korean War saw Higgins boats in action again. The Incheon landing in September 1950 used LCVPs that had been pulled out of storage. They performed just as well as they had in World War II. The Vietnam War saw them used for riverine operations. Even in recent conflicts, the basic design principles have influenced modern landing craft. Military doctrine changed because of the Higgins boat. Before World War II, amphibious assault was considered extremely difficult and risky. After World War II, it became a standard capability for major militaries. The United States Marine Corps built its entire identity around amphibious operations. The ability to project power from sea to land forces on hostile shores, became a cornerstone of American military strategy. This capability exists because a boat builder from Louisiana figured out how to navigate swamps and then applied that knowledge to military problems. It exists because the Marine Corps was willing to look beyond traditional Navy designs and consider a civilian solution. It exists because Andrew Higgins was stubborn enough to keep pushing his design even when the military bureaucracy rejected it. There's a lesson in this story that goes beyond military history. Innovation often comes from unexpected places. The solution to a complex military problem came from a man who built boats for hunters and fishermen. The weapon that helped win World War II was designed for Louisiana swamps, not for the beaches of Normandy. The military establishment initially rejected Higgins' design because it didn't fit their expectations. It wasn't designed by naval architects. It wasn't built in traditional shipyards. It was too simple, too cheap, too civilian. The Navy's Bureau of Ships wanted something more sophisticated, more military. They almost got their way. If the Marine Corps hadn't pushed for the Higgins design, if bureaucratic resistance had won, the Allies might have gone into World War II with inferior landing craft. The consequences are difficult to imagine. This pattern repeats throughout history. Civilian innovations adapted for military use. Simple solutions beating complex ones. Practical experience trumping theoretical design. The people closest to a problem often see solutions that experts miss. Higgins understood boats and water because he'd spent decades building boats for difficult conditions. That practical knowledge was more valuable than all the naval architecture degrees in Washington. The story also illustrates the importance of being willing to admit when you're wrong. The Navy eventually accepted Higgins's design, even though it meant acknowledging that an outsider had solved a problem they couldn't. That willingness to set aside pride and bureaucracy in favor of what actually worked was crucial. In war, there's no room for ego. What matters is what works. Andrew Higgins was not a perfect man. He was difficult to work with. He fought with the Navy constantly. He had a temper. He made and lost fortunes. But he had vision. He saw possibilities that others missed. He understood that a boat designed for one purpose could be adapted for another. He was willing to take risks and challenge conventional wisdom. And because of that, because one stubborn boat builder refused to accept that his swamp boats were useless for military purposes, the course of World War II changed. The Allies gained the capability to land armies on hostile shores. D-Day became possible. Island hopping in the Pacific became possible. The strategy that defeated Germany and Japan became possible. One man's useless invention became Germany's worst nightmare. A simple plywood boat with a flat bottom and a bow ramp changed the world. And the lesson is clear. Never underestimate the power of a simple solution to a complex problem. Never dismiss innovation because it comes from an unexpected source. And never forget that sometimes the most important inventions are the ones that seem obvious only after someone has the courage to build them. The Higgins boat sits in museums now, a relic of a war fought 80 years ago. But its legacy continues every time a military force conducts an amphibious operation, every time troops land on a hostile shore, every time a simple, practical solution proves more valuable than a complex, theoretical one. Andrew Higgins built boats for swamps, but he changed the world. And that's worth remembering. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden stories that changed history. Hit that like button if you enjoyed learning about how a swamp boat became the weapon that won World War II. And we want to hear from you in the comments. What other useless inventions do you think changed the course of history? What overlooked heroes and innovations should we cover next? Drop your thoughts below. Your engagement helps us bring more of these incredible untold stories to light. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.